I'd like to welcome David Connon to our meeting tonight. He's going to be our presenter, presenting Josiah Grinnell and the Iowa Underground Railroad. I'm sure all of you recognize David. He's been with us before. He gave us a presentation on the Confederates the Iowans that fought for the Confederacy back in October of 2019. And he did another one before I was even a member, I know. He always does an excellent job. I've gotten comments from other organizations that have had him present that say they really appreciate how well he does things. So Joshua Grinnell was one of those characters in Iowa history that was kind of bigger than life and had his fingers in a lot of things. So it's going to be interesting to find out how he got involved with the Underground Railroad and what some of his political views and things were. So without any further ado, I will turn this over to David, and I will set him up as a co-host so he can start his program.
Please bear with me for just a moment. Okay. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, everybody, for letting me present to you tonight. It's nice to see you all again. The screen that you see in front of you, it's the Iowa Underground Railroad routes. It covers the main route of the Iowa Underground Railroad, which basically follows the route of today's Interstate 80. You will notice that going clear across the state, you will notice that there are several arrows coming up from Missouri. Those were smaller tributaries feeding into the main course of the Underground Railroad. Now, before I begin, I'd like to suggest that, or tell you that this presentation will be different than others that I've given to this body. In the past, I've been able to stop after fairly short periods of time and entertain questions and comments. Today will be different. I will be asking you to hold them off until the very end. So to make that easier for everybody, I would suggest that if you'd like to get a sheet of paper and a pen and just jot down any of your thoughts, your comments, your questions. That way they will be fresh when we get to the end. So that's my suggestion. Without any further ado, let's begin. Preacher, congressman, Negro stealer. Josiah Bushnell Grinnell was called all of these things during his lifetime. The third moniker, Negro stealer, came from participating in the Iowa Underground Railroad. J. Grinnell had help from other Grinnell residents, most of whom belonged to the Grinnell Congregational Church. At least 37 fugitive slaves passed through Grinnell on the Underground Railroad from Grinnell's founding in 1854 through 1860. These cases are documented. Less well-documented cases could push the number even higher. Iowa was, for the most part, a racist state before and during the Civil War. This is what I mean. Belief in white superiority was the rule, but J.B. Grinnell was an exception. He believed that every human being is made in the image of God, and as such, is valuable and deserves respect. He also thought that all people should have equal rights. Now, such beliefs were considered radical and even dangerous before the Civil War. Josiah Bushnell Grinnell was born in Vermont in 1821. His father died when J.B. was 10 years old. At a young age, J.B. worked hard and earned the trust of adults. J.B. attended the Oneida Academy, a place designed to train men to preach the gospel. The school emphasized abolition and temperance. J.B. became a congregational minister. He served at church in New York State. Reverend J.B. Grinnell preached about the Bible, heaven, hell, and the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. For example, in 1847, Reverend J.B. Grinnell asked in a sermon, "Why is it hard to believe that God can raise the dead?" He was a conscientious minister. On January 17, 1850, after writing a sermon, he wrote in his diary, "Today have done little. read newspapers too much. Oh, for a spiritual mind, sleep too much, do not pray enough. 2 months later, on April 1st, J.B. Grinnell performed the wedding of an African-American couple. Later that year, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. Under this act, federal marshals were able to force bystanders to help deliver slaves to their masters. This meant that abolition-minded citizens could be coerced into violating their consciences. To help a fugitive slave escape or avoid arrest could result in a huge penalty, up to a $1,000 fine and up to 6 months in jail. An early resident of Grinnell, Jesse Macy, called the Fugitive Slave Act one of the most barbarous pieces of legislation enacted by a civilized country. Sometime after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, J.B. Grinnell tried to start a congregational church in Washington, D.C. He is credited with preaching a controversial anti-slavery sermon right in our nation's capital. During this period, he courted and married Julia Chapin. This is a picture of Julia later in life. Shortly after their marriage, J.B. took one of his frequent trips. He wrote his bride, commending you, my dear, to him who is our constant friend. I am your loving and affectionate husband. J.B. might have kept preaching in New York, but he developed a hoarse throat. With sadness, he left the pulpit. He reports visiting Horace Greeley, the famous editor and publisher of the New York Tribune, asking for advice. Now, J.B. already knew Greeley by serving as a freelance reporter for the Tribune. Have you heard the expression, "Go west, young man"? Well, that's what Greeley told J.B., but he told it to lots of other people too. Greeley mentioned that he needed someone to report on the Illinois Agricultural Fair. J.B. accepted this freelance assignment, but he left for Illinois with a dream of starting a colony of like-minded folks out west. After the agricultural fair, he looked into starting a settlement in Missouri, where his wife Julia had inherited land. But J.B. changed his mind when he learned that it was a strongly pro-slavery neighborhood. As a colleague of mine said, serendipity was his best friend. J.B. boarded a train in Illinois heading east when he met two slave hunters on their way to return a fugitive slave. The slave hunters loudly cursed the North as made up of cowards and nigger thieves. J.B. stood up and said, "I oppose slavery," and the men threatened him. An elderly passenger feared for J.B.'s safety. After the slave hunters had departed, the elderly passenger introduced himself as Henry Farnham, the man who financed the Rock Island Railroad. Farnham praised J.B. for standing his ground and suggested he move to Iowa, where Farnham was going to build a railroad clear across the state. Farnham implied that a colony could be built near the rail line, and he told J.B. who to contact about the projected route of the railroad. J.B.'s dream, shadowy at first, starting to take form. He could start a colony and preach in Iowa, as long as his throat held out. He quickly placed a notice in 2 New York newspapers calling for settlers of congenial moral and religious sentiments. But the settlers needed to have enough money to make the school and the church paramount and attractive institutions from the outset. 3 men read those words and met J.B. in Iowa. They were Henry Hamilton, Reverend Homer Hamlin, and Dr. Thomas Holyoke. These men and a handful of other settlers hewed out a colony on the prairie. Their wives stayed back east. J.B. wrote Julia that he hoped that he was laying foundations for a good colony and for us a home. Eventually, the wives and children arrived. Most of the settlers lived moral lives and wanted to educate their children. They also opposed slavery, drinking, and the sale of liquor. An early settler and her husband arrived in the Grinnell colony on a hot summer day. They crawled inside their wagon and slept away the afternoon. They were awakened by singing. She had never heard music so sweet. She learned that the men had come in from their work and were having worship after supper. She said to her husband, "If we have got into a place where they will sing and pray when they are so tired, I think we have got in the right place. The couple started attending Thursday evening prayer meetings. She later recalled, I know they did much to help us bear the trials and perplexities of our pioneer life. The Grinnell Congregational Church was the first church in town, and it was closely linked to the early history of Grinnell. Not everyone belonged to the Congregational Church, but its members cooperated with other Protestant churches in town. Now, on the national scene, U.S. Senator Stephen A. Douglas promoted popular sovereignty in the Kansas and Nebraska territories. This allowed settlers to determine whether the new state would be slave or free. Pro-slavery settlers, especially from Missouri, and abolitionist settlers, mainly from New England, poured into Kansas. The territory was a tinderbox. Pro-slavery men looted the town of Lawrence, and John Brown vengefully killed 5 pro-slavery men at Osawatomie. The conflict began to ramp up. Now, the troubles in Kansas seemed very close to Grinnell residents. Leonard F. Parker stated, slavery and anti-slavery filled the air, and John Brown was arousing every man to thought and action. Literate Grinnell residents, both men and women, read the national and local newspapers, and they discussed slavery and Kansas in a lyceum. Now, you may know that a lyceum was a public meeting, kind of like what we're doing right now, except it was held in person. The State Congregational Association of Ministers, meeting in Grinnell in summer of 1856, discussed the topic. They expressed indignation over the outrages that had been inflicted upon our fellow citizens of Kansas by hordes of armed men from Missouri for the purpose of crushing out liberty. Shortly afterwards, J.B. began campaigning for the Iowa State Senate. He served 1 term in Iowa City. During J.B.'s first year of service in 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott, slave, wasn't a U.S. citizen, and that Congress couldn't prohibit slavery in the territories. Later that year, the State Congregational Association declared that the Dred Scott decision is contrary to the Word of God and is the moral and civil assassination of the colored race, who have rights that we should respect and maintain. The congregational ministers advised all humane and Christian men to disregard its requirements. The next year, Kansas and the slavery question came home to Grinnell in a very personal way. 16-year-old Frances Overton was a slave in Missouri whose master apparently took her with him to Kansas. She escaped and made her way along the Underground Railroad to Grinnell in late 1858. She was fortunate to be in Grinnell. During Frances's stay there, J.B. Grinnell declared in a letter to the editor of the Iowa Statesman in Des Moines that runaway slaves were apt to be fed and warmed here. Now, this was very bold and risky for J.B. to say this publicly, announcing, yep, we're going to help them right here. Even better for Frances, the large Grinnell Congregational Church required members to oppose slavery. Members also agreed to respect the rights and privileges of others, regardless of natural, educational, or social differences. They loved to emphasize the biblical text, quoting Jesus, "Inasmuch as ye have done it to the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me." Best of all, Frances found a home with Amos and Augusta Bixby. Amos was a lawyer, an early Grinnell settler. His law practice was very modest, so he farmed on the side, and Augusta worked as a housewife. The Congregational Church had met in their home in the early days. Frances couldn't read or write, so Augusta homeschooled her, besides caring for their own 2 young children. Frances was treated as a family member who shared in responsibilities and helped with household chores. Augusta learned that Frances didn't know that the earth is round. She also lacked religious knowledge. For example, when Frances saw a picture of Jesus Christ on a cross, she asked, "What are they doing to that man up there?" But she also had distorted religious knowledge. Over time, Frances confided in Augusta that her master's sons had sexually abused her. Years later, Amos reflected that hers was but the unhappy lot of slave girls since the world began. A few Grinnell residents thought it was wrong for Frances to live with the Bixbys. The dissatisfaction of a few increased after the Bixbys began taking Frances to Sunday school. 3 months later, Frances won a prize for memorizing the most scripture. Amos later recalled, this caused offense to some white competitors. More controversy came to Grinnell a few months later when abolitionist John Brown and his party rolled into town, bristling with weapons. It was an unusually warm Saturday in February. The roads were muddy with the blackest, stickiest substance one can imagine, so adhesive that men used to carry wooden paddles in their pockets to scrape it off with. Brown knocked on J.B. Grinnell's door, saying he was a friend of Julia Chapin Grinnell's father. Brown stated, I'm not here for a social visit. I am the awful Brown of whom you have heard, Captain John Brown of Kansas. Brown sought shelter for 2 nights, so he wouldn't have to travel on the Sabbath. Grinnell found housing for Brown, 12 fugitive slaves, and other armed men. Some stayed in the parlor of Grinnell's home, nicknamed Liberty Room. Some stayed in his wool barn, and others in a local hotel. Curious people poured in from the countryside to see Brown's party, and J.B. invited him to speak that night. The room was packed on the 2nd floor of the Grinnell School, a room used for congregational church services on Sunday mornings. 2 evenings in a row, John Brown and his military aide, John Kagi, spoke to cheering crowds. The second night, 3 congregational ministers, including J.B. Grinnell, asked God to bless Brown. They urged the listeners to give contributions to Brown. One of them also asked God to forgive Brown of any wrongs he may have committed. Brown objected, saying he didn't ask forgiveness for anything he had done. J.B. Grinnell thanked Almighty God in behalf of the whole company for his great mercy and protecting care. Some in the crowd were upset. One was Nathaniel W. Clark, the father-in-law of Grinnell co-founder Dr. Thomas Holyoke. Clark was a former sea captain, as suggested by the ship's anchor on his tombstone. He was a former sea captain who had followed his daughter and Dr. Holyoke to Grinnell. Captain Clark knew that John Brown's men had killed a Missouri slave owner and brought runaway slaves with them. Captain Clark saw those slaves as property. Therefore, he thought John Brown was a murderer and a Negro stealer. Captain Clark resented J.B. Grinnell for honoring Brown. The next morning, John Brown and company stopped their wagons in front of the schoolhouse. Brown asked to speak with Leonard F. Parker, the superintendent and future historian of Poweshiek County. Joanna Harris Haynes was one of the school children who scurried out and gathered around Brown, who sat in the driver's seat of a wagon. She later wrote that some irrepressible pickaninnies pushed up the wagon cover and smiled. Before the party rode off to the Quaker settlement at Springdale, well-wishers pushed cakes into their hands. In the following days, J.B. Grinnell worked with William Penn Clark to arrange for John Brown and company to have a free, safe conveyance to Chicago. Not long afterwards, some Iowa newspapers praised J.B. for welcoming Brown. Others criticized J.B. for letting John Brown speak in a church. One wag twisted J.B.'s name, calling him John Brown Grinnell. Decades later, Leonard F. Parker predicted, in the years to come, it may seem remarkable that men stained with blood and planning to take still other lives were admitted with arms in their pockets to this church in February 1859. The town of Grinnell did sympathize with Brown, but it was an honor for him as a friend of an outraged Kansas rather than as an emancipator of either Virginia or Missouri slaves. That summer of 1859, the fugitive slaves who had been with Brown were safe in Canada. In October, Brown's party attacked the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to start a slave rebellion. Instead, Brown was captured, tried, and hanged for treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia. The hanging came on December 2nd, 1859, just 9 months after his appearance in Grinnell. Around this time, Amos Bixby decided to send Frances Overton to Grinnell School. He asked J.B. Grinnell's opinion. J.B. asserted, "Send her to school, and if anyone dare oppose her, he can't stay in the town 24 hours any more than if he had committed a rape." But J.B. underestimated Captain Clark and his like-minded friends. Frances flourished in the Grinnell School and learned very fast, according to Augusta Bixby. Unfortunately for Frances, Captain Clark didn't want his children to attend school on terms of equality with fugitive Negroes. Therefore, he contacted Frances's master in Missouri and a slave hunter who had stopped near Grinnell. The slave hunter had tracked down 2 female slaves from Nebraska all the way to east central Iowa. Captain Clark reportedly told him that a nice piece of property known as Frances is unlawfully harbored in Grinnell. The Bixbys were frightened. Amos later wrote, "Under the fugitive slave law, the penalties for aiding or for harboring fugitive slaves were so severe that one might well dread them." You see, Amos Bixby was struggling financially in the lingering financial panic of 1857. He eked out a living, but he couldn't repay his debts, not even to his own father, not to mention other people. Amos's reputation as an honest man was at risk. In these circumstances, a $1,000 fine would have been disastrous. But Amos and Augusta still sheltered Frances, likely because they cared for her as a person and they loved Jesus. Frances turned their garret, a room just underneath the roof, into a fortress. She reached it through a small hole in the ceiling where she could pull the ladder up after her. Frances kept weapons in the garret. Amos later wrote, "If the slave hunters came, she could keep them at bay until the abolition town was aroused. We depended on such men as Harvey Bliss to rescue her." Bliss was the town grocer who rode his wagon regularly to Iowa City. On at least one occasion, he carried a fugitive slave. Finally, the danger was so imminent that Amos asked school superintendent Leonard F. Parker to get Frances out of town. Parker also belonged to the Grinnell Congregational Church. That evening, between sunset and sunrise, someone drove a team northward carrying Frances. They intended for Frances to find a home among the Quakers in Hardin County, but she only made it as far as Timber Creek in southern Marshall County. On February 1st, 1860, Augusta Bixby grieved, "My poor black girl is gone." Frances departed as the town of Grinnell was in the midst of a religious revival that had started several weeks earlier. Local ministers, including J.B. Grinnell, held afternoon and evening religious meetings Monday through Friday. Leonard F. Parker's wife, Sarah, wrote her mother, "Our meetings are over. The town is much changed. Captain Clark seems converted, and many of our most hardened ones are praying now." During the revival, a Quaker man brought 4 large male fugitives in their early 20s to Grinnell from Tabor in far southwest Iowa. Grinnell residents offered them work. Sarah Parker explained 2 of them wished to go back to Missouri after their wives and children. They were anxious to learn and asked to go to school. Their employers agreed until the spring work came on. The fugitive slaves reasoned that they could better rescue their families if they could read guideposts and friendly written directions. L.F. Parker called the 4 men docile and patient. That probably was a very good thing for them, very helpful, because they entered the lowest grade in the school, and Edna Marsh Buck was their teacher. According to Leonard F. Parker, the children were delighted with their woolly hair, curious pronunciation, and jolly good nature. But their presence offended many. Captain Clark, who had 4 daughters in school, was one who objected strongly. On Sunday, March 11th, 66 people joined the Grinnell Congregational Church. 62 of the new members professed faith in Jesus Christ as Savior. JB was seemingly out of town for this event. The following day was the annual Grinnell school meeting. It was usually just a routine event. But this year, Captain Clark plotted with like-minded men to eject 4 male intruders. L.F. Parker later said that the men had hoped to outwit the abolitionists and make sad Caucasians happy evermore. When the meeting began, Captain Clark and his supporters moved to exclude non-residents from the school. Superintendent Leonard F. Parker responded that the district would lose lots of tuition money. The motion was defeated. The dissenters forced another vote. Shall colored pupils be received in our schools? It passed by a small majority. One frenzied man said, "They shall never enter those doors unless over my dead body." Some residents verbally attacked L.F. and Sarah Parker, both Oberlin College graduates, considered radicals. One resident slandered Sarah Parker and another Oberlin alumna, Jane Cooper, with sexual innuendo. Augusta Bixby stood up for the Oberlin graduates, and the meeting adjourned. Determined men on both sides expected trouble at school the next day. L.F. Parker arrived early Tuesday carrying a blackthorn walking stick, Captain Clark holding a very large cane, and Samuel Scotch Cooper entered the school and told the elementary teacher, Edna Marsh Buck, that they would drive the fugitives from her classroom. She went upstairs and found Parker. He flew down the stairs and confronted the men. Captain Clark and Cooper demanded that the fugitive slaves be kept out of school. Parker said he would defend any student who was entitled to attend. They threatened him, saying, "We know where to find you," and left. Captain Clark and Cooper rejoined a mob that had formed outside of the school. A block away, 2 of the African-American students saw the mob with clubs and, it is supposed, concealed weapons. Anti-slavery men joined the black students and armed them with revolvers. One of the students climbed upon a pile of lumber and made a passionate speech. He said that if they must suffer so to gain their freedom and have all these indignities heaped upon them after they had gained it, they might as well die at once. The fugitive slaves then started across the churchyard toward the schoolhouse. Anti-slavery men persuaded the fugitives to turn back, although they preferred to fight their way through the mob and enter the school. Mob members called on the anti-slavery men to disarm the fugitives, but they would not, for the fugitives' lives had been threatened and they would not deprive them of the means of self-defense. Riot ran wild in the streets until noon. A short calm followed. Both sides discussed what to do next, with mob members loudly denouncing L.F. Parker and the fugitives. Wednesday morning was as exciting as Tuesday. Sarah Parker wrote her mother, "Desperate deeds were meditated. Men, maddened with hate and rage, ran through the streets with insulting words ever on their lips. She feared that her husband might be injured or killed. But we all live. Though knives were whetted for hand-to-hand encounters, guns loaded, and pistols made ready." Sarah Parker later wrote, "The town is not settled yet. It will probably divide the Congregational Church, for several members were in the mob. The school closed, is to commence in 3 weeks." School directors buckled under and changed the rules. They referred to the fugitive slaves as foreign students and required them to pay half of the tuition in advance. This prevented them from returning to school. Amos Bixby's aunt, Sarah H. Bixby, dissented against the board's action. She opened her home as a private school for all colored people in town. Sarah Parker contemplated the revival that had preceded the riot. She quoted scripture, "When the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, Satan came also among them. So it has been here." The fugitive slaves lingered a while in Grinnell, working summer jobs on farms and attending Sarah Bixby's school. One of them stayed with Homer Hamlin and his family, and then they left town. Captain Clark may have succeeded, driving the fugitive slaves out of the public school. He suffered a personal loss. His 5-month-old grandson died shortly after the riot. The baby had been named after him. Captain Clark re-entered the fray less than 3 months later when more fugitive slaves arrived in Grinnell. He alerted newspapers in Iowa and St. Louis of this fact. On July 14, 1860, J.B. Grinnell wrote a note to William Penn Clark that he had sent forward 5 fugitive slaves, 3 women and 2 children, to neighboring Brooklyn. J.B. had learned that there was a reward of $1,000 offered for Nebraska City. About a month later, on August 13th, 3 wagons carrying 15 fugitive slaves arrived in Grinnell. Captain Clark sent a detailed, hostile letter to the Iowa State Journal. He wrote that a grand abolition rally was got up at the schoolhouse to receive them. Captain Clark stated, J.B. Grinnell introduced them who, he said, were Southern gentlemen traveling north for the benefit of their health, as was customary at this season of the year. And as they were rather short of funds, he called for a contribution. 3 days later, a writer for the Iowa State Journal claimed to have seen the 3 wagons full of fugitive slaves within 10 miles of Iowa City. The writer claimed Amos Bixby, then a Republican candidate for office, was chaperone of the wagons. Now, Captain Clark's original letter, noting the 3 wagons of fugitive slaves, had triggered a flurry of responses from J.B. Grinnell's supporters, including Captain Clark's very own son-in-law, Dr. Thomas Holyoke. Captain Clark sent a heated response to Dr. Holyoke's letter. In that letter, Captain Clark gave specific details about Francis Overton and the 4 male fugitive slaves. Using a broad brush, Captain Clark stated, as far as the town of Grinnell is concerned, it has a widespread reputation of being the most notorious rendezvous for stolen and fugitive Negroes west of the Mississippi. Many of them are ultra-abolitionists. Amos Bixby and S.F. Cooper are 2 of them, and all the ink that T. Holyoke ever put on paper can't blot it out. Captain Clark fired a final letter on October 12, 1860. He wrote the journal editor that one of the 4 fugitive slaves had returned to call on Reverend Homer Hamlin. Now, with the start of the Civil War, Captain Clark stopped his letter-writing campaign. However, his relationship with his son-in-law, Dr. Thomas Holyoke, deteriorated, if you can imagine that. The state of Iowa charged Captain Clark with maliciously setting on fire a stack of wheat belonging to Dr. Holyoke. Dr. Holyoke testified that his father-in-law had feelings of the most malignant hatred and enmity toward him and had made many threats. Dr. Holyoke said that he had lived in continual fear of his father-in-law for a long time. The following year, 1863, Holyoke accused Captain Clark of sticking a pitchfork into his horse. That same year, J.B. Grinnell was elected to Congress. He introduced a resolution encouraging African Americans to enlist in the Union Army. The resolution passed. Afterwards, President Lincoln invited Grinnell to his office and said, "It's a great day for the black man when you tell him that he shall carry a gun. It foretells he is to have the full enjoyment of his liberty and manhood." Lincoln concluded, "Now tell your people in Iowa, the time has come when I am for everybody fighting the rebels. Let the Indians fight them. Let Negroes fight them. And if you've got any strong-legged jackasses in Iowa that can kick rebels to death, they have my hearty consent." On another occasion, J.B. complained to Lincoln about dealing with Democrats in Congress. The president said, "Young man," now Grinnell was in his early 40s, "forget your annoyance. They are only as flea bites to mine. They are serious comedy, while I am in the focus of tragedy and fire." Debates on the floor of the House of Representatives sometimes became emotional, as you can imagine, and J.B. sometimes made scathing remarks. After all, he was human. Biographer Charles E. Payne notes that sometimes J.B. would accuse Democrats of being in league with slavery and the devil. After the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln's days were running out. JV was back in Grinnell on a Sunday morning, standing on his pastor's porch when he heard that Lincoln was dead. He later recalled, "Our grief was beyond expression. For the first time in my life, I fainted." After the Civil War ended, JB remained in Congress for a couple of years. Historian Payne observes, Grinnell's uncompromising attitude on Negro rights made him many bitter enemies in the House who lost no opportunity to attack him. On one occasion, during a lull in the debate, a member from Kentucky arose and proposed that to relieve the tediousness of the hour, our pastoral brother from Iowa be invited to sing an abolition song. Quick as a flash, Grinnell was on his feet with the retort, "I'm not a good singer myself, but I'll propose a verse from Isaac Watts and request the member from Kentucky to do the singing." Grinnell then repeated, "And are we rebels still alive? And dare we yet rebel? And is it not amazing grace that we are out of hell?" The response brought down the House, and Grinnell was never again asked to sing. During his service as an Iowa state senator and as a congressman, JB nearly always voted in favor of measures to help educate, empower, and equip African Americans. On 2 occasions, he voted against those measures as a matter of political expediency, of timing, but not as a matter of principle. In 1890, near the end of his life, J.B. Grinnell gave credit to God for driving him forth from his eastern home. J.B. said he had hoped to elevate man and promote the cause of Christ. One of his favorite hymns had these words. A charge to keep I have, a God to glorify, a never dying soul to save, and fitted for the sky, to serve the present age, my calling to fulfill. Oh, may it all my powers engage to do my master's will. By reflecting on JB's life, it's possible to discern reasons for his exemplary beliefs and actions. Several factors seem apparent. First, he probably was a well-adjusted person who, as a child, knew he was loved. 2, he trusted Jesus Christ as his Savior and he believed he was forgiven. 3, he embraced the teachings of the Oneida Academy that slavery should be abolished and all people deserve respect. 4, he was surrounded and assisted by many like-minded people in Grinnell, including his wife, Julia. A last word on the March 1860 riot. As you can imagine, it had taken time for the Grinnell Congregational Church to recover from the divisive effects of the riot. A petition actually went around the church criticizing members who had opposed having fugitive slaves in school. The petition was dropped, but some years later, one erring member cheered a colored graduate of Iowa College, now Grinnell College. Other dissenters supported every radical step in favor of Negroes. I think JB would have approved. Thank you. By the way, before I open it up for comments and questions, I have on the screen, you'll see my email address. And if you wanted to discuss anything in further detail, feel free to email me. But Frank, shall we open it up for questions? Well, sorry?
You're muted, Frank.
Yeah. Frank, can you unmute? Can can you unmute yourself, Frank?
Okay. All right. I think I got it there.
There you go.
So
All right.
I said, I think you're the first presenter we've ever had that sang to us.
Okay.
And you
Well,
did
thanks for
pretty
bearing
well.
with me. Well, thank you.
So anybody have any questions or comments for David?
Frank, I have one question. Can you hear me?
This is for David?
Sure. Yes, sure.
David,
Yeah.
you mentioned that being anti-slavery was a requirement to be a member of the Congregational Church. Is that correct?
Yes.
Was that written into the bylaws of the church or the covenant of the church as well?
I'm not sure. It was documented though, because I quoted exact phrases from the expectations for members.
Okay.
I just can't remember. I can't tell you what the document was. If you want me to try and track down what I noted in my transcription of this, I could send it. I could email that to you.
Yeah, I'll send you an email, okay, and I'll give you my email address as well. Okay.
Sounds good. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
David,
Any other?
this Sherman, did you find that Grinnell was active elsewhere besides just the local area? Was he active across the southern part of the state at all, or did he limit his actions to just the Grinnell area?
I think that he had limited his actions on the Underground Railroad to the Grinnell area. However, and this is important to know, I should say Grinnell was the station on the Iowa Underground Railroad, and he worked with Tom Mitchell, founder of Mitchellville, so as far west as Mitchellville, present-day Mitchellville, and made arrangements with William Penn Clark that took John Brown all the way, getting all the way to Iowa City, and then passing on en route to Chicago, from Iowa City, I should say. I guess boarding the train around Iowa City and then go to Chicago. So he cooperated with people that extended beyond Grinnell, but it was still on the main route of the Iowa Underground Railroad. Did that make any sense?
Yeah. The second question I have to do is that you made a distinction or slight distinction with Brown in terms of the combativeness, okay, that Grinnell opted for a less combative approach. But at that time, during the Kansas scenario, we do know that I think they're called Beecher Bibles, were shipped across southern Iowa into Kansas, this to avoid going across Missouri because of the slavery support across central Missouri.
Yeah.
Did Grinnell have any military, I won't say military, but did he have any kind of support or involvement with this transport of these Beecher Bibles over here to Kansas?
That's a great question. I have not come across any connections between Grinnell and the Beecher Bibles. I looked for it. Incidentally, I spent 6 years doing a heck of a lot of research on early Grinnell history to try and flesh out the story that I shared with you tonight.
Wow.
And I wanted to have answers to questions like that, what you raised, because that would have been a very interesting connection.
I'm just curious because of the involvement over here. I mean, it seems like he limited to just that support for the fugitive slaves, but there was so much else going on in there. It's hard to imagine that he wasn't involved in some of the other aspects. Thanks, Dave. Great program. Excellent.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your question, Sherman.
David, I was interested, did Grinnell have a lot of political influence statewide, or was his his leadership and his influence and so forth more localized in his general area?
I think that his influence in the Iowa Republican Party, it was probably very negligible when he was working on the Underground Railroad and helping other like-minded folks on the Grinnell station of the Underground Railroad. But by the time that he was elected to Congress, then I think that he started to amass more influence within the Iowa Republican Party, and but he had a very strong reputation of being a very strong abolitionist in his background going for him. That kind of buttressed his efforts to grow in stature. So I can't give you a better answer than that right now, Frank.
Okay.
Hi, Joe.
Anybody else?
Yeah, Joe. Joe, can you unmute yourself, please?
Okay.
Thank you.
What was the location in Marshall County for Frances Overton's end of her journey?
Yes, it was Timber Creek. Timber Creek. I found it on an old kind of a plat map of period appropriate plat map of Marshall County, very southernmost Marshall County.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Anybody else? Well, David, I'd like to thank you for your presentation. I agree with Sherm. It was an excellent presentation. You did a great job.
Thank you very much.
And Josiah seems to be a pretty interesting character.
Oh, yeah, he sure was.
Yeah.
He also, early Grinnell residents, for years, they remembered how when early settlers had lived in what one of the earliest structures was called the Longhouse, and they remembered, one of the things they remembered was his jokes kept people laughing into the night. His jokes. So I like that in a guy, in a pastor, in a political leader. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. If there are no further questions, we'd like to thank David, and we'll move on to the business meeting.
Okay. Thank
You're
you
welcome
all.
to
I
hang
will
around if you
check
want to
out.
listen.
Thank you.
Oh.